Okay, so we can continue where we left off this morning, and now I want to look more at the development of the mind itself, the citta bhavana, the various ways of countering the defilements and the various ways of, if you like, preparing the mind for samadhi. And a lot of these things are things we can do outside of meditation practice and also part of the formal meditation practice. But all of them are meant to kind of calm the mind down, get rid of the defilements, and get ready for the deeper states of meditation practice. The first one of these suttas is from the Anguttara Nikaya 3s. It's called the Sukkuma Sutta, I think, in Pali, delicate. And this is essentially about the contemplation of death and also old age and illness. So these three contemplations, often talked about in the suttas, these contemplations, we also had a look at them as part of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. So they're an important part of the Dhamma practice. So this is how it goes. Because I was delicately nurtured, most delicately nurtured, extremely delicately nurtured. At my father's residence, lotus ponds were made just for my enjoyment. In one of them, blue lotuses bloomed. In another one, red lotuses. In a third, white lotuses. I used no sandalwood unless it came from Kasi, and my headdress, jacket, lower garment, and upper garment were made of cloth from Kasi. By day and by night, a white canopy was held over me, so that cold and heat, dust, grass, and dew would not settle on me. I had 3 mansions, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one for the rainy season. I spent the 4 months of the rains in the rainy season mansion, being entertained by musicians, none of whom were male, and I did not leave the mansion. While in other people's homes, slaves, workers, and servants are given broken rice together with sour gruel for their meals. In my father's residence, they were given choice hill rice, meat, and boiled rice. So here we have the Bodhisattva before he went forth, what kind of life he had, right? And of course, this is quite interesting because very often we have all these elaborate stories about the life of the Bodhisattva before he went forth. But if you want to find some of the most authentic teachings the Buddha talks about his own life, this is one of those most authentic ones. And this is a standard passage that you find in a few places. And so this you can take it as the most likely to be exactly what it was like to grow up before the Buddha went forth. And so you can see here the sort of things that he had. He had the lotus ponds. It's interesting, in those days young men enjoyed themselves with lotus ponds. That's maybe slightly different now, but nonetheless. So obviously it is something. It's a luxury item. It costs money to build lotus ponds, right? So obviously it would have been a luxury item regardless. And here again we have this idea, he uses no sandalwood unless it came from Kasi, Benares, like the capital of the luxury goods, right, in those days in India. And my headdress, jacket, lower garment and upper garment, these two were made from Kasi. So again, Kasi cloth was very highly regarded, just like it is today. And just a small point of interest here is that the upper garment here and the lower garment, these are called Uttarasanga and Antaravasaka in Pali here. So in those days, lay people and monastics would wear pretty much the same thing, right? Lay people would wear Antaravasaka, they would wear Uttarasanga, sometimes Sangati, and so would the monastics. So in those days, there was much less difference between the lay people and the monks and the nuns. The only difference would probably be like the coloring or the kind of frills and kind of things like that. The monks would have much plainer and the nuns would have very plain garments, whereas the lay people would have something more fancy or whatever. So that is the cloth. And by day and by night, this canopy was held over the Buddha. He had 3 mansions. The word mansion, perhaps a slight exaggeration. Pasada is the word in Pali. It really depends on that word is used, for example, for houses that are allowable even for monastics. Monastics are allowed to accept pasadas for living in. I don't think mansion is quite right. I think it's more like just a house. It's probably more appropriate translation there. And you can see that. So he's amused himself in these mansions, and obviously enjoyed all sorts of sensual pleasures, etc. And then the very last part there, which I always find is quite nice, is that while in other people's homes, the slaves, workers, and servants were given very basic food, in the house of the Buddha-to-be, they were given good food, right? Meat, choice hill rice, and boiled rice. So these were kind of quality foods. So the idea here is that in a good household, it's not just a household which has, you have lots of money and you have the items of luxury. A good household is also a household where there is a sense of compassion, a sense of kindness, right? And this is one of the things that the Buddha kind of brings in here. So it was a good household both psychologically and also physically. There was 2 aspects to that. That's a nice little touch there at the very end. Now, one of the things, as I said just a couple of minutes ago, is that this is basically what the Buddha's upbringing was about. Then when you read the later literature about the Buddha's upbringing, like things like the Jataka Nidana, for example, the introduction to the Jataka talks a lot about what the Buddha's upbringing was like and his whole life story. And in many of those, especially the Jataka Nidana, it is kind of everything is so exaggerated, right? Kapilavatthu was this enormous capital with millions of people. Everything was just, the Bodhisattva was a prince and his father was a king. There's nothing about that really in the suttas. His father is just called Suddhodana in the Sakyan Suddhodana in the Vinaya Pitaka. And while he was obviously wealthy by the standards of the day, it's still quite subdued. It's still quite normal. And if you read about the archaeological excavations that have been done in India from that time period, there is very little archaeological evidence to show that there were very large buildings and very massive cities. Everything was very small scale in those days, according to the archaeological discoveries that are available. Only later on, only at the time when Pataliputra, present-day Patna, only when that started to become the capital of the Magadhan Empire, around the grandfather of Ashoka, Chandragupta, and maybe a couple of kings before that, that's when the big cities started to emerge. At the time of the Buddha, everything was very small scale, and these would have been very small cities. There was very little stonework used. Most was built of mud and wood and that sort of thing, and everything was quite was very small. Even the big capital like Savatthi, probably, it's hard to know, but probably had at the most maybe a few tens of thousands of people. So it was small scale. And all of this is important, right? It kind of brings the Buddha down to, we see him as an ordinary person who fits into history. He's part of a history. He's not someone who stands outside history. It fits with the archaeological excavations. All of these things kind of come together. It makes everything much more real, rather than these kind of extravagant ideas about who the Buddha was. And one of the things that we were talking about very briefly yesterday in the Q&A session, somebody asked about, how should I practice if I want to become a Sambuddha, right? And the interesting thing, of course, that whole idea about becoming a Sambuddha, what it means to be a Bodhisattva and all of these kind of things, is not really found in the suttas. Yes, you do find the word bodhisattva occasionally, and it basically seems to mean the time after the Buddha went forth from the household life until he reached awakening. That is the bodhisattva period. But of course, in later Buddhism, the idea of the bodhisattva becomes like this massive, enormous thing. When the whole Buddha Vangsa, not the Buddha Vangsa, the Charya-pitaka. The Charya-pitaka is all about the conduct of the Buddha, how he had to practice to eventually become a Buddha. The Jatakas are a similar kind of thing, all the past lives of the Buddhas. And it makes this thing of becoming a Buddha into a path, into a practice, into something which happens over many, many eons. Right? You make a resolution under a past Buddha 4 incalculable eons ago, and then you practice this path until one day you become the Buddha. There is a danger in that. There's a problem with these kind of things. The first thing, of course, is to realize that this is not found in the sutras. It is found in later literature. The Buddha never talked about these things. If the Buddha didn't talk about these things, then how important can they be? Surely, if it was important, if it was something we were supposed to do, the Buddha would have talked about them, right? The very fact that he didn't talk about these things means that they cannot be really important. The second thing, the thing which is really dangerous about this, one of the things that I think is important, as I was saying this morning, is to understand and see the Buddha roughly as a human being, just like us, so that his life becomes an example for us to emulate and practice after the Buddha. This is obviously the reason why the Buddha talks about himself, right? He talks about his own practice, what he did before his awakening, and how he was able to reach awakening. The point, of course, is that we are supposed to be doing the same thing. In the Dveda Vitaka Sutta, he talks about his life, how he divided his thinking into 2 parts. On the one hand, sensual thought and thoughts of ill will. So obviously, he also had those thoughts, right? Just like us, just like everybody else. Perhaps, not very strongly, obviously, but still, he had those kind of thoughts were there. And so these things only become meaningful when we see the Buddha as one of us, as one of humanity. And once you start to bring out the Bodhisattva ideal, this later ideal, you are distancing the Buddha from us. Suddenly he's like a special kind of being, right, who has done this special kind of practice where he has destroyed all the vasanas, these kind of character traits that are part of him. So he has become this kind of non-person in a sense. If you destroy and you make an end of all the character traits, you're not really a person anymore. You become this kind of archetype kind of thing with no kind of, not even archetype, probably the wrong word. You become this somebody completely without personal characteristics. I don't know what that is. You're not really a human being anymore at that point. You're something else. So all of these things, they tend to distance us from the Buddha. So for that reason, although many of these things are obviously well meant, the idea is probably to give us inspiration and faith in the Buddha and all of these things, there is a disadvantage to those things as well. And that disadvantage, I think, is that it creates a gap between us and the Buddha. It's very hard for us to see the Buddha as an ordinary human being once we create this image of somebody who has done these practices. And this, of course, is something that we see throughout the history of Buddhism. The history of Buddhism, in many ways, is one of raising the Buddha up on a false kind of pedestal. Of course, he deserves to be on a pedestal, but it deserves it for completely different reasons. He deserves it because of his wisdom, because of his understanding, because of his ability to help us on the path. He doesn't deserve it because he's a god, because he's a cosmic principle, because he's the Dhammakaya, whatever they call it in the Mahayana Buddhism. I don't know anything about Mahayana Buddhism, but sometimes you hear these words, right? So all of this, that is not why the Buddha should be raised on a pedestal. We're raising him on a pedestal for the wrong reason. And by doing that, we are destroying some of that inspiration that comes through in the suttas. The idea we're supposed to emulate the Buddha and practice the way that he did. So I think we need to be careful with those things. Yes, and of course in Mahayana Buddhism they go much further. In Mahayana Buddhism they decide that not only was the Buddha a bodhisattva, but all of us were supposed to be bodhisattvas, right? We're all supposed to practice the bodhisattva path and become Buddhas. And that, I think, also is dangerous, because if you do that, first of all, you're not doing what the Buddha said we should be doing, but secondly, you're making the goal so distant, so far away. I think often it's difficult to find the motivation to practice properly here and now. It's just so far away that it becomes almost completely intangible, completely lost in many ways. So that's just a little bit about the Bodhisattva ideal. There is a very nice book by German monk Venerable Analayo. He has written about the Bodhisattva ideal, how it kind of arose, how it came out of the early suttas, and how it then was built up in later literature to become, to become what it is in the present day. And of course, the reason, one of the arguments that he makes for the arising of the Bodhisattva ideal is precisely this feeling when the Buddha passed away. There was a feeling of emptiness in the community, right? Both the lay people and the monastics feeling the absence of the Buddha. The Buddha wasn't there anymore. And when the Buddha isn't there anymore, you have to do something else to fill that gap. And one of the things you do is to try to reconstruct his past. And this is part of this rising of the Bodhisattva ideal, the rising of the Jataka stories, the Charya Pitaka, and all of these other kind of things. Anyway, so just a little bit about these things. All of these things are interesting because I think they all touch on us. There are so many people these days who try to follow this Bodhisattva path, but the Buddha never taught the Bodhisattva path. And if the Buddha didn't teach it, then who has the authority to teach such a path? That is one thing I always wonder about. Who has the authority to lay down a Bodhisattva path if the Buddha didn't do so? Okay, so now let us have a look at the actual contemplations here. So, this is what the Buddha says. Amid such splendor and a delicate life, it occurred to me, an uninstructed worldling, though himself subject to old age, not exempt from old age, feels repelled, humiliated, and disgusted when he sees another who is old, overlooking his own situation. Now I too am subject to old age, and not exempt from old age. Such being the case, if I were to feel repelled, humiliated, and disgusted when seeing another who is old, that would not be proper for me. When I reflected thus, my intoxication with youth was completely abandoned. Right, so he starts off by saying, amid such splendor and a delicate life. In other words, even though I had such a good life, even though my life was kind of at the very top of what life could be like in India in those days, still this reflection occurred to me here. And of course these are the things which eventually make the Buddha go forth, right, and become a monastic. So it doesn't matter if you have a good life or whatever, that's all quite irrelevant. The point that these things override any kind of quality of life that you may have. So he thinks this very nice little reflection here, right? The ordinary person, when he sees someone who is someone else who is older, you feel kind of repelled by it. It's humiliating. It's kind of disgusting when you see somebody who is really older. Right? And of course the idea here of old in this case means like really, really old. Old to the point where you can no longer look after yourself. You're kind of just lying on a bed and people have to do everything for you. And it is kind of humiliating, right? When you see that, you feel, it's very easy to feel a slight sense of repulsion. And why? Why is that you feel repulsion? Where does that come from? And what it comes from is your attachment to who you are now, your attachment to your body, your attachment to your strength, your attachment to your independence, your attachment to looking after yourself, your attachment to whatever it is, your attachment to youth eventually, right? Or at least, if not youth, at least being younger than that person. This is where that humiliation comes from. And then it is very useful to remember that the conditions that are needed for you to become old, they are already in place, right? What is the condition for old age? We have just seen that independent arising. It's very obvious. The condition for old age is birth. Once you are born, that's it. You had it. Old age is already there. Birth and old age are opposite sides of the same coin, right? So it's already in you. It's kind of sitting inside of you, waiting to come out. The old age is already there. It's already part of you, part of your very makeup. And when you think like that, when you can actually feel that come almost like being inside of you, being part of who you are, being part of your your psychology, whatever it is, your body, your physical body, and all of this, then of course, that intoxication with youth, as it says here, is abandoned, because you no longer identify with that youth. You know that this body is just as much old as it is young. Youth, old age, middle age, any age, these are just different aspects of the same thing. They are not different, and you cannot really identify with any one of them, because they're always changing, always moving around. Any kind of identity is false, because it's just a changing process. And then you abandon, it says here, this intoxication with youth. You abandon this falseness, the delusion that comes from being intoxicated. And intoxication here is exactly the same thing as the intoxication that you have when you are drunk, right? This is obviously an intoxication. In the Pali Suttas, there are many things that can intoxicate you. Of course, later on we will see that the same thing with being alive can intoxicate you, because you forget you're going to die. Sensual pleasures are intoxicating, right? You go out and you indulge in sensual pleasures. All of these things are intoxicating. And of course, just like drinking alcohol or using drugs can be intoxicating, what does that do to you? It makes you do stupid things, right? When you are drunk, that is when you kind of do all kind of crazy stuff. You say things you regret later on. You do acts that you regret later on. And in exactly the same way, if you forget that you're going to be old, you're going to die, it's exactly the same problem that is happening. You're intoxicated to a certain extent. And because you are, that is why you end up doing stupid things, thinking the wrong thoughts, acting in the wrong way, speaking in the wrong way. And that simple act of reminding yourself that old age is already here. In a very real sense, I'm already old, because it's part of me. It's inside of this very body right now. Then, of course, that changes the picture, and it turns things around, and it makes things very different. And one of the things, of course, that happens when you are older is that it's very hard to really enjoy the world anymore. It's very difficult to enjoy the world, because your senses start to break down. You can't see properly, you can't taste properly, you can't walk around properly. Everything is breaking down. The world is becoming more and more suffering, less and less interesting for you. And because of that, because the world is becoming suffering, all you're doing is just lying there on the bed, waiting for somebody to feed you, pretty much, right? It almost gets to that point sometimes. And of course then, at that point, it becomes much easier to let go of this world. If the world doesn't provide you with any happiness, and it's all about suffering, you start to let go. There's no interest in this world anymore. And when you start to let go of this world, the attachment is reduced, the desire for the things in this world are reduced. So these contemplations, what they do, if they're able to reduce your attachments and desires, it means they make you peaceful. That's really what they do. Right? All of these things, the things relating to this world, are starting to be meaningless to you, so you become peaceful. So this is one of the great ways that just contemplating old age, we're going to look at death in a second, which is even more powerful, but even just contemplating old age, if you do it in the right way, it can actually be peaceful, because it allows you to let go of this world. You understand the limitations of this world. Okay, so that is the old age contemplation, and let's move on to the next one, which is the illness or sickness contemplation, which is very similar to the previous one. Again, it occurred to me, an uninstructed worldling, though himself subject to illness, not exempt from illness, feels repelled, humiliated, and disgusted when he sees another who is ill, overlooking his own situation. Now I too am subject to illness, am not exempt from illness. Such being the case, if I were to feel repelled, humiliated, and disgusted when seeing another who is ill, that would not be proper for me. When I reflected thus, my intoxication with health was completely abandoned. Right? So again, we're talking about the uninstructed worldly here, the ordinary person, the asuttava putujana. Asuttava literally means one who hasn't heard, one who hasn't been instructed, who hasn't heard any Dhamma, any good teachings. Putujana, the common man, the common person. The Putu is many. Jhana, person, the many person, the ordinary guy. So these are the putujanas. So these are always contrasts in the suttas with the Aryas. So again, so you feel, you know that illness is part of life. Illness is an aspect of what it is to be alive, right? To have health. Health and illness, opposite sides of the same coin. There would be no such thing as health unless there was illness. So when you see somebody who is really ill, you know they have very severe cancer, or they have maybe some kind of AIDS or some illness which is very crippling, and they can't really do anything for themselves anymore. How do you feel about that? Are you okay? Can you see yourself in that situation? Can you see that one day you are very likely to be there yourself? We're all heading in that direction, right? Especially when you get older, it's very easy to get ill. Sometimes we really have very debilitating illnesses where we are completely at the mercy of the care of other people, and there's nothing we can do about it. And you know that famous that saying which Ajahn Brahmali said, which actually is very good. He says that when you go to the doctor, you should never say to the doctor, something is wrong with me. You should say to the doctor, doctor, I'm sick today, something is right with me. Right, and it's kind of, when people think it's funny, but it's quite profound, right? It's actually very real. When you realize that actually there's something really is right with you when you're sick. There's nothing wrong with you at all. This actually is the flip side of health. It is part of life. When you see that, actually it has it has this clarifying effect on the mind, clears out all the nonsense, clears out a lot of the attachment to the body. When you understand that the body has this nature, it becomes much less attractive, right? Anytime you can come down with an illness, anytime you can find yourself hanging over the toilet and you're vomiting and all these kind of things. These things happen all the time. And of course it is at that time you start to understand the problem with the physical body. And again, because of that, you abandon some of your attachments, abandon some of your desires for this physical world, this kama loka, because you start to understand its limitations. So that, again, very similar to the idea of old age, because these things have a similar effect on the body, obviously. And now we come lastly to the reflection on death. And this reflection is the most important one in the suttas. And as I said before, the way to decide whether a particular teaching is important or not in the suttas is just to see how often it is repeated, how many different contexts, how many different themes, varieties on the same theme that the Buddha teaches a certain thing. And when you see that something is repeated very often, different varieties on the same theme, to different people, to lay people, to monastics, to the monks, to the nuns, to everybody, then you know that something is very important. And the death contemplation, which in the suttas is called either marana sati, the recollection of death, or marana sanya, the perception of death, this is one of those that you see a lot. So this is the most important of these three, and obviously because it drives home the point that is being taught by the other ones much more profoundly here. So this goes as follows. Again, it occurred to me, an uninstructed worldling, though himself subject to death, not exempt from death, feels repelled, humiliated, and disgusted when he sees another who has died, overlooking his own situation. Now, I too am subject to death, I'm not exempt from death. Such being the case, if I were to feel repelled, humiliated, and disgusted when seeing another who has died, that would not be proper for me. When I reflected thus, my intoxication with life was completely abandoned. Right? Intoxication with life is it sounds strange, doesn't it? Intoxication with life, but it's this thing. I'm alive, I can do things, all of this. But you remember the flip side of the coin again, two sides of the same coin. Life and death always come together. These are not, once you have been born, you are stuffed, as they say. That's it. You've had it, you're going to die. Suffering is yours, just waiting for it to arrive. So here we have the death contemplation, and again, how how do we do this? How do we actually get into this idea that we're going to die? And there is many ways you can do this death contemplation. Very simple ways, just to remind you every day that you could die today. And once you remind yourself that you could die today, it means that you tend to treat the people you meet on that day in a different way. If you know that this might be the last time you see somebody, you're not going to leave them in an argument, right? You're going to leave them in a good way and wish them well, whatever, on their journey or whatever it is that you want to do. This changes your attitude to things. I remember meeting a man in Australia some years ago. He was originally from Sri Lanka. He was a psychologist, and he told me that every day when he left his house, he made sure that he left his wife and his kids in a good way, because he said he used the idea of maranasati. I could die today. I don't want to leave my wife and my kids in a bad way. So he made sure that every day he left his family in a good way before he went off to work. Right? It's a very simple way, but a very also very useful way of using the idea of maranasati. So that is one way, but of course we want to make it even more powerful than that. We want to make it even more, something even more meaningful to us. And of course one of the things that the Buddha does in the suttas, he reminds us that death is an ever-present reality. You just don't know when it can happen. In one of the suttas in the Anguttara Nikaya, what he does, he just lists many different causes from which you could die. Right? He says, today I could eat something, I could choke on it. Right? People die from choking all the time. They get something the wrong way and they can't breathe anymore, and suddenly that's it, it's finished. You read about these things in newspapers. You think, oh, newspaper, that's somebody else, got nothing to do with me. But of course it has something to do with us, right? This is the thing. When you see it in the newspaper, that could be you. We tend to dissociate from those things. This happens to other people, doesn't happen to me. And that is where we go wrong. We need to understand that that person could precisely be us. The Buddha says you could go out of your kuti, and when you go out of your kuti, you could trip on something, fall over, and that could be enough to make you die. You could meet with a snake, right? That could certainly happen in Australia. It can, of course, happen here in Sri Lanka as well, especially when you live in the jungle. I know some of you live in the jungle, so I know that that is the case. Right? You go into jungle, snake comes. You happen to step on a snake. Snakes don't like to be stepped on, so they bite you, right? And then it happens to be a very venomous snake, and that's it. And sometimes I remember reading this article in Australia. There was a farmer somewhere, living somewhere far out in the countryside. And some of the Australian snakes are incredibly venomous. Some of the most venomous snakes in the world happen to be in Australia. And he had been bitten by this small snake, right? Very, very small one. Oh, I thought, oh, just a baby snake, no problem, right? And within half an hour he was dead. So this is the kind of the danger is kind of ever present. Actually, there's a sutta about that. There's a sutta in the this is in the Pasenadi Samyutta. There's 4 things you should never disrespect because of their young age. One is a Katya king. One is a fire. Right? If a fire is young, you shouldn't kind of just say, yeah, it's only a small fire. Before you know it, it's very large. The Katya king. The snake, right? The small snake is just as dangerous, as venomous as a big one. And the 4th one you should never underestimate because of young age is the samana, the ascetic. The 4 things. One of those is the small snake. So it just reminds us again of the ever presence of death. The ever potential for death is always so close. Or it can be an illness. We don't know. These days, people are stressed out. Sometimes they have high blood pressure, cholesterol problems, whatnot. Suddenly one day you just keel over. That's it. Heart attack. You're finished. It can happen so fast. Never think that it cannot happen to you. It can happen to each one of us, whether you are a layperson or a monastic or whatever it is. Suddenly it is just all over. And this brings the reality of death into the present moment. You start to realize that life is just so precarious, so uncertain. When you look at this body, it is so complicated, right? I mean, some of you here are doctors. You know how complicated this body is. All these kind of things kind of have to do with these tiny little blood vessels, working through all the muscles and the brain or whatever. And I'm astonished that such a complicated body doesn't go wrong more often. I find it absolutely remarkable, all of these things that have to work. It's very obvious that this body sometimes will stuff up. That's just, when you have a body which has so many things that have to somehow work together and cooperate, of course, it's not always going to work. So remember this, and I always remind myself that if I am not ready to die now, in this present moment, this is the only time I can be ready. If I'm not ready to die now, if I'm going to put it off, say, yeah, tomorrow I'll sort it out. If I'm not ready to do it now, I'm not going to do it tomorrow. Because the same thing that is blocking me from being ready now is also going to block me tomorrow. So now is the only opportunity. Now is the chance to drive it home. If you're not ready now, then you're not going to be ready when you actually die. So this kind of brings it into reality. So are you ready to die now? The Buddha says in one sutta, he asked the monks, do you do contemplation of death? And one monk says, yes, master, I do contemplation of death. How do you do it? Oh, I think that, after the meal, I can't remember exactly the sequence, after the meal, I might be dead. And the Buddha says, okay, he kind of doesn't really approve of him. And he asked the other monks. And then, another monk says, oh, I think, soon, I might even sooner than that. And there's 6 or 7 different answers. And then finally, there is one monk who says, I think I might be dead on the next in-breath or the next out-breath. And then the Buddha says, good, you are doing the Maranasati in the right way. So the idea is to bring the idea of death right into the present moment. You could be dead at any time, right in this moment. Right? Next breath you could be dead. Can you do that? Try to feel that. It's actually quite hard to do, right? It's not easy to do that. You have to have a lot of mindfulness and courage to kind of be able to do that. But this is the Buddha's idea. Because when you do that, and this is kind of the importance of this, when you bring the sense of death right into the present moment, what happens is that this world suddenly has no interest for you anymore. If you could be dead on the next breath, there is no point in desiring things in this world. You're not going to think about your next relationship or the next sports car, right? All of that becomes stupid. It becomes completely silly. You're on your deathbed. You're about to draw your last breath. Everything in this world becomes completely irrelevant to you. You're not going to be upset with anybody. You're not going to have any desires about anything. And because of that, the idea here, this thing, if you do it in the right way, it actually makes you very peaceful. You start to feel really peaceful in the here and now. And sometimes you see that. You see people who have lived a good life and who are able to let go when they die. Remember that the more sila you practice in this life, the more happiness you produce for yourself inside, the more independence you will have when you die, because the less important will be all the external things. So to help your death, it is very important to do what is right in this world right now. Practice your sila, do what is good, be kind to others, create a sense of refuge for yourself inside of you. That refuge is all the good karma that you build up. And then when you die, you have the refuge, and you're not so dependent on external things for your happiness. And then, of course, you can die peacefully. And sometimes you see that. You see people who die peacefully because, precisely, they're able to let go of this world. They realize this world has nothing more to offer me. Okay, I'm out of here. So this is the potential for this is the idea with the death contemplation, and this is the potential that it has. So try that. And use it and see if it actually has these effects on you. Remember, these contemplations are meant for everyone, certainly for monastics, but also for lay people, because of the power and the reality in these ways of thinking about these things. Okay. So then your intoxication with life goes, right? And when intoxication goes, you see things clearly, your mind clears up, and then you can sit down, you can watch your breath or whatever, and maybe you can enter a state of samadhi. There was actually one sutta, that's right, there's one sutta I was just looking at just early on today. I always look at the suttas all the time, especially when I do the sutta retreats, because it's nice to kind of fill your mind with suttas. And what this sutta was saying, this was also about the maranasati and also the old age contemplation, all of these things. This is actually a sutta I think I did here last year, I think. And it says that when you do the maranasati in the right way, it actually leads you to entering the path. And entering the path in this case obviously means either becoming a stream enter or dhammanusari or sadhanusari or something like that. So it actually says if you do these contemplations in the right way, these things lead you to that goal. Maybe not alone, but certainly in combination with something else. So they're very powerful contemplations. Okay. Let's have a look at the remainder of this sutta. There are, bhikkhus, these three kinds of intoxication, right? We have just been seeing that now. What three? Intoxication with youth, intoxication with health, and intoxication with life. An uninstructed worldling, intoxicated with youth, engages in misconduct by body, speech, and mind. With the breakup of the body after death, he is reborn in the plane of misery, in a bad destination in the lower world, in hell. An uninstructed worldling, intoxicated with health, engages in misconduct by body, speech, and mind. With the breakup of the body after death, he is reborn in the plane of misery, in a bad destination in the lower world, in hell. An uninstructed worldling, intoxicated with life, engages in misconduct by body, speech, and mind. With the breakup of the body after death, he is reborn in the plane of misery, in a bad destination in the lower world, in hell. So here, again, this idea that you are intoxicated, right? Intoxication is really just an aspect of delusion. You are deluded. You don't understand the priorities in life, what actually is important and what is not. And these things, they help you to get your priorities right. You start to understand what is important in life, what matters, what should be kind of done first, and what should actually be forgotten about altogether. So you can see that simple contemplations with powerful effects in getting your priorities right. And sometimes I think that in Buddhism, sometimes these fairly simple contemplations are things that perhaps we should do more of, because these have the ability to clear out some of the defilements. Sometimes you can watch the breath and not really feel you're getting anywhere. And some of these things can aid you, move you towards that samadhi that you're trying to achieve by watching the breath, clearing out the nonsense, getting a sense of clarity, and then moving you on as a consequence. And then comes the very last paragraph, which is very nice and very apt for all the monastics. And it goes as follows. Intoxicated with youth, a bhikkhu gives up the training and reverts to the lower life. Or intoxicated with health, he gives up the training or reverts to the lower life. Or intoxicated with life, he gives up the training and reverts to the lower life. Right? So this is the sort of thing that leads you to disrobal. You forget that life, you forget the downside of life, you forget the limits, you forget where it's all ending. If you could die on the next in-breath, even if you could die tomorrow, what would be the point of disrobing? What would be the point of stopping the monastic life and entering into some kind of relationship which you know is going to be impermanent? You could die tomorrow. All you're doing is you're attaching to somebody, and before you even get a chance to get properly attached, you're already out of here, and you're going to have to suffer the consequences of whatever attachment that you have built up. All of that stuff becomes meaningless and pointless in the face of death. So if you can bring that idea of death into your life, then the chances of disrobal are massively reduced. But you have to do it in the right way, right? You can do the death contemplation and still upending disrobing if it doesn't really grab your heart. It really has to grab your heart, grab your mind, and then it becomes a power to stop you from doing these things. And again, here you see the idea here is the idea of reverting to the lower life, right? The lay life is consistently called the lower life in the suttas, and the reason for that is not because it is a bad life as such, but because it is a life which doesn't, one of the reasons I think simply because it doesn't lead as quickly to nibbana as the monastic life. It doesn't have quite the same potential. And also probably because usually it involves more indulging in sensual pleasures, which in the suttas are always called the lower kind of pleasure. Whereas monastic life, hopefully, at least after a while, you start to instead look at the higher pleasures of the mind instead. So, there you are. So if you're going to have a long life as a monastic, please do especially the death contemplation. It has so many benefits, right? And all you have to do sometimes is just to walk back and forth and remind yourself of these things. You don't have to think too much, you don't have to make enormous amount out of it, but just remind yourself that death can come at any time. Sometimes the way of doing this kind of contemplation is also just to imagine yourself on the deathbed and see what it feels like. Go through the process of dying and see what it actually feels like. See if you can imagine, you know it's going to come soon anyway, you might as well get used to it now. So what does it actually feel like when you lie on a deathbed? Are you ready for that? Are you able to let go? And once you start to get into that, actually it can be a very beautiful meditation exercise just to do a death contemplation. If I feel like it, maybe we can go through do a death contemplation during the meditation today, just to get some feeling for what it's like. But the idea is, if it makes you let go, if it allows you to let go of this world, allows you to let go of the body, it can actually be quite nice and feel very peaceful and very beautiful as a consequence. Okay, so that is the death contemplation. I don't think I want to move on to the next sutta now because we only have really a few minutes left. So I'll probably stop there. And then tomorrow we can continue with the next contemplations and things tomorrow. So that is all for now, and see you again this evening here.